Hello and welcome to First Christian Church's Adult Fellowship Bible Study. We continue in our study of Acts. Uh, However, today's lesson moves us into chapter 8, where a major change in Luke's storyline is beginning to develop. Recall from our last lesson at the end of chapter 7 that the story closed with the stoning of Stephen, a Christian prophet, lead minister, and deacon to the diaspora Jewish Christian community. Saul was present and in approval of his stoning, apparently. So let's read the first 8 verses of chapter 8 in the New Revised Standard Version. And Saul approved of their killing him. That day, a severe persecution began against the church in Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered throughout the countryside of Judea and Samaria. Devout men buried Stephen and made loud lamentations over him. But Saul was ravaging the church by entering house after house, dragging off both men and women. He committed them to prison. Now those who were scattered went from the place to place, proclaiming the word. Philip went down to the city of Samaria and proclaimed the Messiah to them. The crowds, with one accord, listened eagerly to what was said by Philip, hearing and seeing the signs that he did. For unclean spirits, crying with loud shrieks, came out of many that were possessed, and many others who were paralyzed or lame were cured. So there was great joy in their city. We included the first 3 verses of chapter 8 there in last week's lesson, also, as well as today, to ensure the context in both lessons, because those verses there tend to end part and start something new. Today's reading was short, but scholars note that what takes place in these few verses is highly significant and so often overlooked and should be studied carefully in context and maybe with some reading between the lines. Up to this point, Acts has been a narrative focused on the beginning of the Christian movement as it was centered in Jerusalem, either in or near the Jewish temple. Now the narrative shifts to the beginning of the church's mission beyond Jerusalem, teaches Dr. Robert Wall. Dr. William H. Willimon, emeritus professor of Duke's Divinity School, adds, "Now those opening words of verse 4 begin a new step in Christian evangelization of the world. But we must not fail to appreciate what was happening, and that what was happening was violent persecution by Judean Jews aimed at putting troublesome Christians back in their place in Judaism and removing others. Instead, that persecution also served to put them out in Samaria and beyond, one step beyond its original intended recipients of the gospel, which were the Judean Jews." Willimon says, note carefully, who are the outcasts that takes up extending the Christian mission at this point? It is not the apostles, who are still in Jerusalem. What Christians remain in Jerusalem with the apostles, if any, is not clear, however. But some scholars suggest those Judean Jewish converts to Christianity is implied here, that's only that group that seems to stay, is implied but not said. Scholars at this point remind us of some important history that is germane to this storyline. They teach it is clear from contemporary Jewish literature from the 200-year period prior to Christ that a critical zeal for purity to the Mosaic law occurred in Judaism, which was during the Hasmonean Maccabean period. That zeal continued into the 1st century AD, driven by the temple religion, especially by the Sadducees. Conflict within Judaism had developed between the Judean Jews and the Hellenistic or diasporic Jews, especially over newer theology that was creeping in from the Greek and Persian influence and thinking. Thus, a significant portion of the zealous persecution was aimed at silencing the diaspora or Hellenistic Jews that worshipped with them, and their new ideas that were entering Judaism was causing problems. They were being rejected by the more conservative Sadducees, such as the belief in the resurrection of the dead, which was not a Jewish concept originally. Within the Christian movement, up to this point in Acts, Christian converts are from either the Judean Jews or they're from Hellenistic diaspora Jews. Gentiles have not yet entered the Christian community. Stephen's community was the diaspora Hellenistic Jewish people that had converted to Christianity. They now accept Jesus. In other words, that group of Jews accepted Jesus as the Messiah and converted to what we would call Christianity. As this chapter opens, we see this Christian portion of the movement has been scattered outside Jerusalem into the Judean countryside and Samaria, while the apostles are still inside Jerusalem. It appears Philip has surfaced as Stephen's replacement in the ministerial role. Recall, Philip is one of the 7 deacons selected from within that diaspora Jewish Christian community to serve the Hellenistic Christian widows. So at this point, it seems the apostles, who are all Judean Jewish Christians, converts remain in Jerusalem. But what Christians remain with them is not clear. Scholars note to what real degree these two Christian communities now separate is not clear. But we get some ideas that there is a separation as you compare the book of James, the epistle of James, with Paul's writings and some of the other writings. Because clearly there's a difference that's laid out there in the book of James as compared to the others. And now these outcasts are in the Samaritan land. Willimon says, and do not forget that there is a long history of enmity between the Judean Jews and the Samaritans. That is germane here to what's going on. And Luke here assumes his reader knows that history and the story there and why it's important for them to understand that. The Jews essentially considered Samaritans as racially impure and religiously inferior, even though they worshiped the same God of Israel, observed the same Mosaic law with some exceptions or variations, observed the same Sabbath day and the same holy seasons, and they looked forward to a messianic figure's arrival, which the Sadducees did not necessarily accept, but the Pharisees did. Furthermore, modern genetic research shows that they were descendants of Joseph, a remnant of the 10 tribes of Israel that was left behind in the West Bank area when most were exiled. So these would be Ephraim and Manasseh, or portions of those people. So Jewish purity laws of the time prohibited dealing with the Samaritans, even to the point that we see Jesus prohibiting his disciples from entering Samaritan towns when he sends them off two by two to teach. Probably because, or some scholars say, likely because he didn't want to get the movement in trouble with the law at that point. The timing wasn't right. Samaritans use only the first 5 books of the Bible as canon scripture, just like the Sadducees. All other writings in the Jewish Old Testament were considered non-canon literature. The 5 books they used were different, however, in several places from the Jewish Torah. But most of those differences are minor things such as spelling and so forth. Excuse me. Modern research supports that their version, however, the Samaritan version, is the older of the 2 Torahs. The biggest difference related to the placement of the holy sites, or temple, or tabernacle at the time that the Judean people enter the Promised Land. That the Samaritan Deuteronomy says Mount Gerizim, while the Hebrew says Mount Ebal. Both sites are peaks west of the Jordan River and were north of Jerusalem. However, the greatest schism with Judaism occurred during the Hasmonean time when the Maccabees destroyed their temple in late 2nd century BC. During the Roman 1st century AD, the military and political headquarters for Palestine was in Samaria area, the Samaritan area, at Caesarea. An arrangement, by the way, that the Jews did not like at all. So the Samaritans at the time of Luke's storyline were outcast within the household of Israel and the Jewish mindset. Their temple was in the wrong place, and the Samaritans did not consider the second temple, or Herod's temple, as it was known at the time, as where God has placed his name. It was not holy to the Samaritans, while the Temple Mount was considered the holiest of all sites by the Jews. Dr. Carl Holliday notes that in these verses we see the Christian movement experiencing on a grand scale what Jesus predicted. By the Jews dispersing the Christians to Judean countryside and Samaria, they are being put outside the temple. They're being put outside of the Judean ruling zone of authority, and into Roman ruled area, that area was ruled under a Roman prefect at that headquarters in Caesarea. Dr. Holliday teaches that Saul's harassment here, and the Greek wording is better rendered ravaged, which is more than insulting these people, but would involve physical harm, as well as probably, he says, loosing predatory animals on them, which was common before the 1st century. Dragging these people here implies violent removal of these people from their home. Dr. Eugene Boring notes this persecution of the church early on here, we should make sure we discern the difference between it, which is occurring by the Judean Jews, and distinguish it in our mind from the more famous, much later persecution of the church that occurs by the Romans. This is a separate persecution event. Seems to be related more, he says, to internal conflicts within Judaism that's occurring at the time between the temple people and the rest of Judaism, rather than and trying to keep them towards some sort of orthodoxy as outlined by the Sadducees. And not so much at this point, it's not over the Christian issue of Jesus being the Messiah, he says. That will be a different story later in the Romans, in which it is the fact that Jesus is considered the king, the Messiah, which is a big part of why they're being persecuted. So he says we must separate those in our mindset, and he notes that modern day Christians haven't done a very good job, he says, of doing that. He notes, Dr. Boren also notes that some of the manuscripts here will indicate that Samarian city, the city of Samaria, but no such city existed at the time that this event is supposed to be happening. Instead, Samaria was destroyed 700 years before, at the time the Assyrians destroyed the house of Israel and dispersed the people of the northern 10 tribes. But was rebuilt later by the Greeks and then destroyed again in that John Hyrcanus of the Maccabean Hasmonean group destroyed it in around 100, a little bit before 100 BC. Then it was rebuilt again later by Herod the Great, and that city's name then was changed to Sebaste, which it still went by at that time. So he may have been referring to that city, but it's not named that and hadn't been named that for hundreds of years. And it continued to have that name, that new name, all during the Roman rule. So they're not really sure what he's referring to. Some suspect that that Luke here probably was referring either to another city in Samarian land, or possibly this city that had at one time been Samaria, and he just didn't have his records quite accurate. Some scholars note that Luke really never pins a specific reason that this Jerusalem Jewish persecution of Christians is occurring. It's not nailed down clearly here. But as you study the history, we get a better idea of what's going on. But several note the wording, except for the apostles, may give us a key clue that it was directed at the Hellenistic Jewish converts like Stephen, and not towards the Palestinian, Judean, Jewish converts of which the apostles were from. So we have what appears to be a division occurring in the Christian community at this point. In verse 5, Philip seems to be taking on the role as the lead minister of this new group, this Hellenistic Christian Jewish community, convert community. He seems to be replacing Stevens. Likely, scholars suggest, as he too is one of the 7 that was picked to handle the welfare, he's taking on greater responsibility. Those deacons were more than just deacons. They were also doing ministerial, missionary work, if you will. Philip went down, it says here, meaning he went north into the lower elevations from the hills and mountainous areas right there around Jerusalem. It appears clearly they are evangelizing the Samaritan people. The Samaritans, if we think about this, the Samaritans would probably have been a fairly easily convert. They expected a Messiah. The idea would have been then to teach them that Messiah has already come, that Messiah is Jesus, and then present the gospel story. Dr. Eugene Bourne and Fred Craddock in their New Testament community teach Philip did not have to claim new ideas, new theories, new religious principles, or new theology to these people, only that their God had already acted decisively for human salvation and sent the Messiah, who was Jesus the Christ. Thus, this would have been a logical first step of a church growth beyond the Judean Jewish orientation up to this point. They do not have to deal with the Samaritans becoming Jews first, before they're accepted into the Christian faith. An issue that becomes very important when later in Acts we see the conversion of Gentiles. Some of the other things that were in that read we didn't touch on. They're fairly easy to perceive. It was my opinion in doing the work here, researching this, that the history and context is more important, and it then becomes almost a new study of what's there. So I hope this gives you some idea of at least how the modern scholars are looking at the interpretation of what's going to go on here in chapter 8 and what Luke is trying to tell us something about, and that the way he words that. Hope you have a good Bible study, and hope to see you in the next class.